November 2004. A FedEx truck pulled up to the gates of Dimebag Darrell's Arlington, Texas home on a Tuesday afternoon, when the autumn sun was cutting through the oak trees in lazy golden angles. The driver carried a wooden crate, custom-built, reinforced at the corners, heavier than it looked. The return address was a P.O. box in Studio City, California, but anyone in the metal world would have recognized the handwriting on the shipping label. Sharp, confident, unmistakably the penmanship of someone who had signed 10,000 autographs and still made each letter count. Eddie Van Halen had sent Dimebag Darrell a gift, and inside that crate was something that would remain sealed, untouched, and completely unknown to the world for 15 years. Because Dimebag Darrell never got the chance to open it. 26 days after that package arrived, 6 bullets from a Beretta 9mm would end his life on a stage in Columbus, Ohio, and the wooden crate would disappear into the chaos of grief, logistics, and a family trying to process the unthinkable. Vinnie, Dimebag's brother, would eventually find it, but what he discovered inside that box, and the note Eddie had written, would change everything the metal community thought they knew about the relationship between two of the greatest guitarists who ever lived. But before we dive into what was in that package and why Eddie Van Halen chose November 2004 to send it, if you're fascinated by the untold stories behind metal's most iconic figures, hit that subscribe button. This channel digs deep into the moments that shaped legends, the secrets that stayed buried, and the connections that defined an era. You won't want to miss what's coming. The world knew Eddie Van Halen and Dimebag Darrell respected each other. Any fan of metal guitar in the 1980s and 90s understood that these were two players who had fundamentally altered what the instrument could do, what it could sound like, how far you could push 6 strings and 24 frets into territories that made people's faces contort with disbelief. Eddie had done it first, exploding onto the scene in 1978 with a self-titled album that made every other guitar player on Earth reassess their entire approach. His two-handed tapping technique, his harmonic squeals, his dive-bomb vibrato bar attacks. These were not just innovations. They were declarations of war against every convention rock guitar had ever established. And Dimebag, born Darrell Abbott, had grown up worshiping that sound. As a teenager in Arlington, Texas, Dimebag had worn out his copy of Van Halen's debut album, had learned every note of Eruption, had tried to reverse engineer the magic that made Eddie's playing feel like it was breaking the laws of physics. But Dimebag didn't just copy Eddie. He took those lessons and forged his own path, developing a groove-heavy, brutally precise style that would define Pantera's sound and cement his place as one of metal's most influential players. By the time Cowboys from Hell dropped in 1990, Dimebag Darrell was not Eddie Van Halen's student anymore. He was his peer. What the public didn't know, what even most people in the music industry didn't fully grasp, was that Eddie and Dimebag had become friends. Not the surface level, we ran into each other at an awards show kind of friends. Real friends. The kind who called each other at 2 a.m. to talk about gear, who sent each other rough mixes of new songs before anyone else heard them, who shared the kind of vulnerabilities that only make sense between two people who understand what it means to have the weight of expectation crushing down on them every time they pick up a guitar. Eddie had reached out to Dimebag in the early 90s, after hearing Vulgar Display of Power and realizing that this kid from Texas had taken everything Eddie believed about aggression and melody and somehow made it even more dangerous. They started talking. Phone calls that stretched for hours. Conversations about tone, about pickups, about how to make a guitar scream without losing the song underneath it. And somewhere in those conversations, a bond formed that went deeper than music. Eddie saw in Dimebag something he recognized in himself, a refusal to play it safe, a willingness to be ridiculed if it meant staying true to a vision that nobody else could see yet. And Dimebag saw in Eddie a kind of validation he had never expected, the knowledge that one of his heroes not only respected his work, but understood the cost of creating it. They met in person for the first time at a NAMM show in Anaheim in 1993, backstage in a crowded hallway that smelled like guitar polish and ambition. Eddie had spotted Dimebag from across the room, that unmistakable figure with the goatee dyed pink, the camouflage shorts, the sleeveless shirt showing off arms that looked like they had been carved out of Texas limestone. Eddie walked straight over, ignoring the cluster of industry people trying to grab his attention, and when he reached Dimebag, he didn't say anything at first. He just held out his hand, and Dimebag took it, and the two of them stood there for a moment in the middle of that chaos, grinning at each other like they were sharing a joke that nobody else would ever understand. Later that night, they ended up in a hotel bar, just the two of them, drinking and talking until the sky started to lighten outside the windows. Eddie told Dimebag about the pressure of being Eddie Van Halen, about how every new album felt like he was trying to outrun a shadow version of himself that the world had decided was the only version that mattered. And Dimebag told Eddie about Pantera's struggles, about how the band had spent years trying to break through, about the frustration of knowing you're the best at what you do, but still having to prove it to people who don't want to listen. By the time they left that bar, something had shifted. They weren't just peers anymore. They were brothers. Eddie Van Halen had built his reputation not just on his playing, but on his guitars. The Frankenstein, the iconic red, white, and black striped instrument that had become synonymous with his name, was a Frankenstein in the truest sense, a mongrel creation assembled from parts that shouldn't have worked together but somehow did. Eddie had always been obsessed with building, with modifying, with taking something off the rack and tearing it apart until it became something new. His garage in Studio City was a workshop, a mad scientist's laboratory where he spent hours alone, soldering pickups, rooting bodies, experimenting with neck angles and fret sizes and every microscopic variable that could change the way a note sounded. Most of those experiments ended up in the trash or buried in a closet somewhere, failed attempts at chasing a sound that existed only in Eddie's head. But some of them, a rare few, turned into something special. And in the autumn of 2004, Eddie had finished building a guitar that he knew, with the kind of certainty that comes from 30 years of obsessive craftsmanship, was one of the best things he had ever created. The guitar was a Frankenstein-style Stratocaster, but unlike the iconic red and white version that everyone associated with Eddie, this one was finished in a deep metallic blue with silver lightning bolts hand-painted across the body. Eddie had spent months on it, not because it was difficult, but because he wanted every detail to be perfect. The neck was from a 1972 Strat, worn smooth by decades of playing, the kind of neck that felt like it had been molded specifically for your hand. The body was alder, lightweight, resonant, with a tone that Eddie described in his notes as singing even when you're not plugging it in. The pickups were custom wound, a combination of a humbucker in the bridge position and two single coils in the middle and neck, wired in a way that gave the guitar a tonal range Eddie had been chasing for years. And the tremolo system, the part that Eddie obsessed over more than anything else, was a Floyd Rose unit that he had modified so extensively that it barely resembled the original design anymore. The tuning stability was flawless. The sustain was endless. The way the guitar responded to the slightest touch, the way it seemed to anticipate what you wanted to play, before you even thought about it. This was not just a tool. This was a voice. Eddie had originally built the guitar for himself, intending to use it on the next Van Halen album, whenever that might happen. But as he played it, as he spent weeks in his garage running it through every test he could think of, something changed. He started to think about Dimebag. He thought about the conversations they'd had over the years, about the way Dimebag had always been so generous with his knowledge, so willing to share what he had learned, even when it might have given someone else an edge. He thought about how Dimebag had always played Dean guitars, those sharp, angular ML models that looked like weapons, but how Dimebag had once told Eddie that he'd love to own a real Frankenstein-style guitar, something with that Van Halen DNA in it. And the more Eddie played this new Blue Lightning guitar, the more he realized it didn't belong to him. It belonged to Dimebag. So in early November of 2004, Eddie made a decision. He would send the guitar to Dimebag as a gift. Not for any special occasion, not because he wanted anything in return, but because that's what brothers did. They gave each other the best of what they had. Eddie Van Halen was not known for being sentimental. In interviews, he often came across as guarded, deflecting personal questions with humor or technical talk about guitars and amplifiers. But when he sat down to write the note that would accompany the Blue Lightning guitar, something in him opened up. He wrote it by hand, on a piece of paper torn from a legal pad, his handwriting slanting across the lines in that same sharp script that had been on the shipping label. The note was 3 pages long, and what Eddie wrote in those pages would not be seen by anyone except Vinnie Paul for 15 years. Because when the wooden crate arrived at Dimebag's house in November 2004, Dimebag was in the middle of preparing for Damageplan's tour. The crate got moved into the garage, set against a wall behind some road cases and boxes of merch, and it sat there, unopened, waiting for Dimebag to have a free afternoon to see what Eddie had sent him. That afternoon never came. On December 8th, 2004, Dimebag Darrell was shot and killed on stage at the Alrosa Villa nightclub in Columbus, Ohio. The news hit the metal community like a physical blow, a gut punch that left people staggering and disoriented. Eddie Van Halen heard about it while he was in his garage, working on another guitar. Someone called him, maybe it was his wife Valerie, maybe it was his son Wolfgang. The details of who delivered the news have never been clear. But what is clear is that Eddie's first thought, after the initial shock and disbelief, was about the guitar. He had sent it. Dimebag would have received it. But had Dimebag opened it? Had he read the note? Eddie tried calling Vinnie Paul, but Vinnie's phone was either off or overwhelmed with calls, and Eddie couldn't get through. For days, Eddie didn't know. He showed up at Dimebag's funeral, where he famously placed his original yellow and black Bumblebee guitar in the casket, a gesture that made headlines around the world. But the Blue Lightning guitar, the one in the wooden crate, that never came up. Eddie assumed Dimebag had opened it, had played it, had read the note. And in his grief, Eddie didn't ask. He didn't want to intrude on Vinnie's pain with questions about a guitar. Vinnie Paul, meanwhile, was drowning. In the weeks and months after Dimebag's death, Vinnie had to deal with logistics that no one should ever have to face. Funeral arrangements, legal issues, the constant presence of media wanting statements, wanting reactions, wanting Vinnie to perform his grief for cameras. And in the middle of all that, Vinnie had to go through Dimebag's house, had to sort through a lifetime of possessions and decide what to keep, what to donate, what to sell. It was during one of those sessions, sometime in early 2005, that Vinnie found the wooden crate in the garage. He recognized Eddie's handwriting on the label. He knew immediately what it was, or at least he thought he did. Eddie had probably sent Dimebag a piece of gear, maybe a guitar, maybe some vintage amp, the kind of thing musicians send each other all the time. Vinnie almost didn't open it. The thought of seeing something Eddie had sent, something Dimebag had never gotten to use, felt unbearable. But eventually, he did. He pried the crate open with a crowbar, pulled away the foam padding inside, and there it was. The blue lightning guitar, gleaming under the garage's fluorescent lights, looking like something from another dimension, and beneath the guitar, tucked into the case, was the note. Vinnie Paul read Eddie's note standing in that garage, and by the time he finished, he was crying. Not the quiet, dignified tears of someone trying to maintain composure, but the raw, choking sobs of someone who had been holding too much inside for too long. The note was not what Vinnie expected. It was not a casual message about gear or a friendly hello. It was Eddie Van Halen, one of the most guarded and private figures in rock history, pouring his heart out onto 3 pages of lined paper. Eddie wrote about his struggles with addiction, about how alcohol had nearly destroyed him, about the nights when he didn't think he would survive to see another morning. He wrote about the pressure of being a guitar hero, about how the world wanted you to be superhuman, but never gave you permission to be human. And he wrote about Dimebag, about how much their friendship had meant to him, about how Dimebag was one of the only people who understood what it felt like to carry the weight of other people's expectations while trying to stay true to yourself. Eddie wrote that building the Blue Lightning guitar had been a form of therapy, a way to focus his energy on something pure and good during a time when everything else in his life felt chaotic and uncertain. And he wrote that giving it to Dimebag was his way of saying thank you, not just for the music Dimebag had created, but for the friendship he had offered, for the late-night phone calls, for the understanding that you didn't have to explain to someone who already knew. The last line of the note was the one that broke Vinnie. Eddie had written, "You're my brother, Dime. Not by blood, but by what matters more. Take care of this guitar. It's got a piece of me in it. And now it's got a piece of you, too. Keep ripping. Keep being you. The world needs it. I need it." Vinnie stood there in that garage, holding the note in one hand and steadying himself against a workbench with the other. And he made a decision. He would not tell anyone about this. Not yet. Maybe not ever. The note was too personal, too raw, too much of both Eddie and Dimebag's souls exposed on paper. Vinnie felt like he was holding something sacred, and the idea of letting that become public, of letting it be analyzed and dissected and turned into content for magazines and websites, felt like a violation. So Vinnie took the guitar and the note, put them back in the crate, and moved the crate to a storage unit in Dallas, where he kept other items that had belonged to Dimebag. And for 15 years, the Blue Lightning guitar and Eddie's note remained there, untouched, unknown to anyone except Vinnie. But keeping that secret took a toll. Vinnie Paul was not a man who enjoyed hiding things. He was blunt, straightforward, the kind of person who said what he thought and didn't worry about the consequences. But this was different. This was a promise he had made to himself, a way of protecting something that felt too fragile to expose to the world. And as the years passed, as Vinnie continued to grieve for his brother and struggle with his own demons, the weight of that secret grew heavier. He thought about telling people, thought about what it would mean to share Eddie's words and let the world see a side of Eddie Van Halen that almost no one knew existed. But every time he considered it, something stopped him. Fear, maybe, or loyalty, or the knowledge that once you let something like that into the public sphere, you can never take it back. Eddie Van Halen died on October 6, 2020, after a long battle with cancer. The news sent shockwaves through the music world, tributes pouring in from every corner of rock and metal, everyone from Slash to Kirk Hammett to Tom Morello sharing stories about Eddie's influence and generosity. Vinnie Paul had died 2 years earlier, in June of 2018, from heart disease, and his passing had been its own kind of tragedy for the metal community. The Abbott brothers were gone. Pantera's legacy was now entirely in the past tense, a chapter of music history that would never have a sequel. But after Eddie's death, something shifted. The people who had been close to Eddie, his family, his bandmates, his friends, they started sharing stories that had been kept private during his lifetime. And one of those stories involved a phone call Eddie had made to his son Wolfgang about a month before he died. Eddie had been in bad shape by then, the cancer having spread beyond the point where treatment could do much more than buy time. He was weak, barely able to play guitar anymore, spending most of his days in bed or sitting in a chair in his studio, surrounded by instruments he could no longer use. But his mind was still sharp, still turning over memories and regrets and the things he wished he had done differently. And during one of those conversations with Wolfgang, Eddie brought up Dimebag Darrell. He told Wolfgang about the Blue Lightning guitar, about the note he had written, about how he had never known if Dimebag had received it, had read it, had understood what Eddie was trying to say. Wolfgang, who had been a child when Dimebag died and had only heard stories about him, asked his father what the note had said. Eddie told him. And then Eddie said something that Wolfgang would later share with a journalist, doing a retrospective piece on Eddie's life. Eddie said, "I hope Vinnie read it. I hope he knows what Dime meant to me, because I never got to say it out loud." That quote, buried in the middle of a long article about Eddie's final months, caught the attention of someone who had been close to Vinnie Paul. That person reached out to the journalist, and eventually, the story of the Blue Lightning guitar and Eddie's note began to circulate within a small circle of people in the metal community. It took another year, but eventually, the people managing Vinnie Paul's estate decided to make the guitar and the note public. They did it carefully, respectfully, releasing the information through a documentary about Dimebag's life and legacy that premiered in late 2021. The documentary included footage of the Blue Lightning guitar, still in pristine condition, never played, still sitting in the case where Eddie had placed it. And the documentary included Eddie's note, read aloud by Wolfgang Van Halen, his voice cracking as he spoke his father's words. The metal community's reaction was immediate and overwhelming. For days, social media was flooded with tributes, with people sharing their own memories of Dimebag and Eddie, with musicians posting videos of themselves playing Van Halen songs and Pantera songs back to back. The note resonated because it confirmed what so many people had suspected but never fully understood, that behind the bravado and the stage personas, these guitar heroes were human beings dealing with the same fears and insecurities and need for connection that everyone else experiences. Eddie's vulnerability in that note, his willingness to admit that he needed Dimebag's friendship as much as Dimebag might have needed his, it shattered the myth of the untouchable guitar god and replaced it with something more real, more valuable. And for the people who had been part of the metal scene in the 90s and early 2000s, the revelation felt like a gift, a final piece of the story that brought a sense of closure to a tragedy that had never fully healed. The Blue Lightning guitar still exists, It is currently on display at the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in Cleveland, on loan from the Abbott family estate, positioned in a case between Eddie Van Halen's original, Frankenstein, and one of Dimebag's Dean ML guitars. The curators chose that placement deliberately, wanting to create a visual representation of the connection between two players who had helped define what rock guitar could be. And every day, people walk past that case and stop, drawn by the gleam of the blue metallic finish, by the silver lightning bolts that seem to move in the light, by the knowledge of the story behind it. The placard next to the guitar includes a quote from Eddie's note, the last line, the one about being brothers not by blood, but by what matters more. And for many visitors, especially those who remember the 90s metal scene, that placard is enough to bring tears. But the guitar's importance goes beyond its place in a museum. In the years since the note was revealed, other musicians have come forward with their own stories about Eddie Van Halen's generosity, about gifts he had given them, advice he had offered, support he had provided when they were struggling. Kirk Hammett of Metallica shared a story about Eddie calling him after Cliff Burton died, offering condolences and understanding without trying to fix anything. Zakk Wylde talked about Eddie teaching him a specific technique for harmonic squeals during a chance meeting at a guitar shop, spending 2 hours on it even though Eddie had somewhere else to be. And Dimebag's former bandmates in Pantera, Rex Brown and Phil Anselmo, both spoke about how Dimebag had always talked about Eddie with a reverence that went beyond admiration. How Dimebag had considered Eddie not just an influence, but a touchstone, a reminder of why playing guitar mattered. The note also changed the way people understood Eddie Van Halen's final years. In the public narrative, Eddie's last decade had often been portrayed as tragic, defined by illness and decline, and the slow fading of a once brilliant talent. But the note revealed something else. It showed that Eddie had been thinking deeply about his relationships, about the people who had mattered to him, about the ways he had tried to express connection and gratitude even when words felt inadequate. Building that guitar for Dimebag had been an act of love, and the fact that Dimebag never received it, never knew it existed, that was heartbreaking. But it was also, in a strange way, perfect. Because the gift was not really about the guitar. It was about the gesture, about Eddie taking the time to create something beautiful and meaningful and then giving it away. Not because he expected anything in return, but because that's what you did for someone you loved. What Eddie Van Halen understood, and what he tried to express in that note to Dimebag Darrell, was that brotherhood in the music world is not about competition. It's not about who can play faster, who can write better songs, who can sell more records. It's about recognizing yourself in someone else, about seeing another person struggle with the same demons and doubts and fears that you carry, and choosing to reach out instead of retreating into isolation. Eddie and Dimebag never played on a record together. They never toured together. They never stood on the same stage at the same time, at least not in any documented performance. But they were brothers in the way that mattered, connected by an understanding that went deeper than any collaboration could have captured. And that's the real legacy of the Blue Lightning guitar and the note that accompanied it. It's a reminder that the things we create, whether it's a song or a guitar or a 3-page letter, those things have the power to outlive us, to carry our intentions and emotions forward into a future we'll never see. Eddie Van Halen died without knowing that his note would eventually be read by millions of people, without knowing that his gesture would become part of the story that defines him. Dimebag Darrell died without ever seeing the guitar Eddie built for him, without reading the words Eddie wrote, without knowing how much their friendship had meant to the person he admired most. But the connection between them survived. It survived because Vinnie Paul made the difficult choice to protect it, even when keeping that secret cost him something. And it survived because Wolfgang Van Halen had the courage to share his father's vulnerability with the world, to let people see Eddie not as a guitar god, but as a human being trying to tell someone he cared about them. The Blue Lightning guitar sits in its case in Cleveland, and it will never be played. That was a decision made by the Abbott family and the Van Halen estate together, a choice to preserve the instrument exactly as Eddie left it, as a symbol rather than a tool. Some people think that's a waste, that Dimebag would have wanted the guitar to be used, to make music, to fulfill the purpose for which it was built. But others understand that some things are more valuable as relics, as physical reminders of moments and emotions that can't be recreated or replicated. And when you stand in front of that case, when you look at the blue metallic finish and the silver lightning bolts and the worn Stratocaster neck that Eddie had chosen specifically for Dimebag, you don't think about the music that guitar might have made. You think about the love that went into building it, about the friendship that made it necessary, about the tragedy that kept it silent. And you understand that sometimes the most powerful gifts are the ones that never get opened, because their value is not in what they do, it's in what they mean.